Yes, thank you. It's always great to see a terrific crowd. And this is our second event this spring. Some of you might have been here a couple of weeks ago for the Elizabeth Strout conversation. It was really another one of those extraordinary evenings. And yes, Kate and the Friends of the Library do a tremendous amount of work on our behalf, and every penny that they raise does indeed come back to the library and supports evenings like this, the summer reading, and any other kind of special programs that the library has, so we couldn't do without them. So please indulge me in one more round of applause for the Friends. Arlington Reads is now in its 12th year of creating community through reading. And throughout the years, we've experienced together the thrill of bringing the country's preeminent authors to meet with us in person and talk about their works, and tonight is no exception. I'm also delighted to be able to announce to you that our good fortune with bringing top-flight authors continues, and we have just contracted with 2 authors for next year. Catherine Boo, National Book Award winner, author of the Behind the Beautiful Forevers, and the Harvard sociologist, and as of a couple of weeks ago, Pulitzer Prize winner Matthew Desmond, author of Evicted: Poverty and Profit in the American City. Two very exciting authors writing about events that matter, and certainly, again, this evening is no exception. So we chose Arlington Reads' theme this year, Why Fiction Matters, and we're particularly excited to present both Ms. Strout and Mr. Nguyen this evening. I believe I said when Ms. Strout was here, but it bears repeating, we can all agree that over the past year, truth, and those whose job it is to unearth it, have taken a bashing. So there's a certain irony in our looking to fiction writers for the illumination of what is real. Tonight it's an honor to welcome into Arlington Viet Nguyen, author of The Sympathizer and winner of the 2016 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. In awarding that prize, the Pulitzer Committee called The Sympathizer a profound, startling, and beautifully crafted debut novel. The story of a man of 2 minds, someone whose political beliefs clash with his individual loyalties. In dialogue with, but diametrically opposed to the narratives of the Vietnam War that had preceded it, this novel offers an important and unfamiliar new perspective on the war, that of a conflicted communist sympathizer, an astonishing work that is at once a gripping spy novel, an astute exploration of extreme politics, and a moving love story. The book won the American Library Association's Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Fiction and the Dayton Literary Peace Prize in Fiction, the only annual U.S. literary award recognizing the power of the written word to promote peace. Mr. Nguyen is also the author of a 2016 nonfiction work, Nothing Ever Dies: Vietnam and the Memory of War, called A Critical Bookend to the Sympathizer, and it was a finalist for both the National Book Award and the National Book Critics Circle Award for Nonfiction. His most recent work, and we'll talk about that a little bit this evening, is The Refugees, a collection of short stories poignantly dedicated to all refugees everywhere. We in Arlington are also home to many refugees who fled the Vietnam War in the late 1970s and early 1980s, and we're especially delighted to welcome Mr. Nguyen to our community. In 2016, Arlington County produced a 28-page full-color booklet entitled Echoes of Little Saigon, Vietnamese Immigration and the Changing Face of Arlington. There were copies available out in the lobby earlier. I hope many of you were able to pick one up. It's really quite an extraordinary achievement. It talks about the period when Vietnam's refugees transformed Arlington's Clarendon neighborhood. How many of you actually remember? Right. Yeah. Those were great restaurants. Great restaurants. I miss them. And that was, we sort of called the enclave Little Saigon, home to the Vietnamese department and jewelry stores, grocers, and restaurants. The booklet was produced with a $9,000 grant from the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities in collaboration with Arlington County's Cultural Affairs Division and Historic Preservation Program, and representatives from those departments are here with us tonight to celebrate not only their achievement, but Mr. Nguyen's success with his writing. Along with other archival research, the booklet features excerpts from oral histories, interviews with members of the Vietnamese community, and all of those were conducted and recorded by graduate students at Virginia Tech, and they're now available to researchers in our own Center for Local History. So we're really excited about this collaborative project. We hope you take a copy and you enjoy it, and we're very interested in trying to pursue other kinds of these stories, because the oral histories from people who actually lived those times is incredibly important, not only for us today, but for those who come after us and want to understand how and why things happen. Born in Vietnam, Viet Nguyen came to the United States with his family as a refugee at the age of 4 after the fall of Saigon in 1975. His family first settled in Pennsylvania and then later moved to San Jose, California, where his parents opened a Vietnamese grocery store. He received a BA in both English and Ethnic Studies and a PhD in English from UC Berkeley. Afterward, moved to Los Angeles for a teaching position at the University of Southern California, where he is currently chair of English and professor of English and American Studies and Ethnicity. He won the 2017 John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation Fellowship in Fiction. That's long. Intended for individuals who have already demonstrated exceptional capacity for productive scholarship or exceptional creative ability in the arts. And we understand that this fellowship will enable him to dedicate himself to writing fiction full-time over the next academic year, and that he's currently working on a second novel, The Committed, which is a sequel to The Sympathizer. So without further delay, please join me in welcoming Mr. Nguyen.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Long-winded.
Oh, it's lovely. Can I do something first?
Of course.
Yeah. Can I take a picture?
Yes.
That's okay. That's so cool. All right. Yeah, there we go. Because this is an awesome crowd. Plus, I'm Asian. I can't help it. Take a picture. All right. Thank you all for coming. It's just really wonderful to see so many people out here loving books, loving libraries as well.
I can't top that. That was a great beginning. Can you all hear me? Yes. All right. We're going to have a conversation up here. It is being recorded, and then we will turn the event over to you all to ask questions, and we'll just have some fun and see where the questions take us. So without hesitating further, I wanted to begin at the beginning. I mentioned in the remarks that your family left Vietnam in 1975 during the fall of Saigon, or the liberation, depending on your point of view, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So can you talk a little bit about what that experience was like? I know you've referred to it as a traumatizing experience, and your writing has helped you deal with that, but can you give us some flavor of what that was about?
Well, I mean, honestly, I didn't really actually remember very much about the fall of Saigon because I was 4 years old. When I really started to remember, actually, was when I came to the United States, and we ended up in a refugee camp at Fort Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania. There were 4 refugee camps set up throughout the country to absorb Vietnamese refugees, and we ended up in Harrisburg. We resettled in Harrisburg. And what happened is that in order to leave one of these refugee camps, you had to have a sponsor. And typically, sponsors would take an entire family. So if an American family would take a family, or a church would take a family. In our case, for whatever reason, we were broken up. So my parents were taken by one sponsor, my 10-year-old brother was taken by another sponsor, and 4-year-old me was taken by a third. And that's when my memory really began, my narrative memory, being taken away from my parents. And I remember just howling and screaming, and it was, and that meant that for me, my memory began with being a refugee and with being separated from my parents. And it's remained an invisible brand stamped between my shoulder blades, emotionally very devastating, and something that I think I suppressed for many decades of my life because I didn't want to confront that moment again. But I think it's been really formative for me because that's been one reason why I think I've never stopped being a refugee, because there's some emotional part of me that's been shaped by that experience of separation and being taken away and then eventually being brought back.
Now, I read in a number of interviews that you draw a very clear distinction between immigrant and refugee, and yet we tend to lump them all together. and feel that that experience is also part of the American dream. You know, you come here, you start over, you bootstrap your way up. Can you talk a little bit about why that distinction is so important to you?
Well, I think that even in moments in American history where we're anti-immigrant, as at least half the American population seems to be at this moment, and you know, we've also been anti-immigrant through significant parts of our history. You have to remember that from 1882 to 1965, the doors of this country were mostly closed to non-white immigrants. And yet, nevertheless, the immigrant is a really important part of American mythology. So that even if you don't like immigrants, you like the fact that immigrants want to come to this country because that makes you feel better about yourself as an American. You know, of course people want to come here and take our jobs. We wouldn't want to take our jobs. You know, but the refugee is different. I think the refugee brings with them the fear of failure and contamination, because the refugee has come because their country has been destroyed in one way or another. And Americans don't like to think that that could happen here in the United States as well. So for example, Hurricane Katrina, when that happened and all these people were displaced, some of the media called these folks refugees. And President Bush said, it's un-American to call these people refugees. And possibly for the only time in his life, Jesse Jackson agreed with George Bush and said, it's racist to call African Americans refugees. Right. So there is something in the American psyche that thinks it's just impossible for an American to become a refugee, although it is possible for refugees to become Americans and in that way be elevated one step closer to heaven.
Right. That was good.
It's true. Yeah.
So your family left behind a stepsister.
Adopted sister.
Adopted stepsister. And you have been back to Vietnam a number of times since then. So can you talk a little bit about what that experience has been like?
Well, I left in 1975 and I didn't go back until 2002, 27 years. And my parents actually went back in the early 90s. So the United States had embargoed Vietnam from 1975 to 1994. And in 1994 reestablished, I think it was political relations, and 95 economic relations. And so my parents took advantage of that to go back to Vietnam for the first time. And you have to understand, my parents were refugees twice. They were born in North Vietnam. When the country was divided in 1954, they fled from North Vietnam to South Vietnam along with 800,000 other Catholics who feared communist persecution. My mother left with her family, my father left by himself. So my father did not see his family for 40 years. My mother didn't see her family for 20 years. So they went back in the early 90s, and they went probably back when I was in school, so I couldn't go with them. My parents, the entire time I'd been growing up, had been saying to me, we're 100% Vietnamese, okay? After the second time in Vietnam, they come back, my dad says, over Thanksgiving, we're Americans now. Okay? And he, I think, and my parents, like many other overseas Vietnamese or Vietnamese Americans or Vietnamese refugees, really had an ambivalent relationship with returning to Vietnam because they feared what would happen to them when they went back. They feared the communists, and to some extent, I think not only they feared their families, but they feared entanglement, emotional entanglements and financial entanglements with their families. So that rubbed off on me. So it took me a long time to get the will to go back to Vietnam in 2002. I went back as a tourist for 2 weeks. I had a great time. If you're a tourist, it's fantastic in Vietnam. You have a great time. And then from 2002 to 2012, I went back 5 or 6 times to do research. I was there for about a year altogether. And the more times I went back, the more I delved into the country, the more complicated it began. I still had a good time. I still partied and went to nightclubs and other kind of stuff. But I began to see many more layers of the country and many more of the complexities and ambiguities. And I went back also to do research for Nothing Ever Dies, which meant that, you know, most of you as tourists, you go back to eat the good food and go to the beaches and stuff. I was going back to see graveyards and war memorials and battlefields. And so I got a whole another perception of what was happening beneath the surface in Vietnam, because tourists, when they go to Vietnam, they get the good side. Besides getting cheated, that might happen to you, but you get the good side in terms of people being very friendly to you. And I had to talk to people about the difficulties of the post-war years and the difficulties of globalization and economic renovation in Vietnam and the contradictions and the fact that, you know, many Americans, when they go to Vietnam or go back to Vietnam, they go back with a certain kind of trepidation because Americans are aware we fought this war, you know, and they think maybe the Vietnamese will hate us. And almost uniformly, Americans say, wow, you know, the Vietnamese people are so lovely, they've forgiven Americans. Not the same experience when you're a Vietnamese American going back, because it's a much more tense situation. You know, because we left as the losers, as the traitors, as the puppets. These are the terms that were being used to describe us. And then we left, and a lot of the Vietnamese our relatives who stayed will look at us and think, you're just the fat, wealthy Americans, you got lucky. And for us, we had to stay here and endure ration economy and very difficult circumstances and communist persecution. So for us, for the overseas Vietnamese who returned, it's much more ambivalent. You know, you have to think of this was a civil war in addition to a revolutionary war. And Americans have not resolved their civil war after 100 years, 130 years, 40 years, and we haven't after 40 years either.
But it starts to sound like you almost are homeless. You belong neither here nor there, or there's that constant tension between, am I a Vietnamese American? Am I an American who happened to be born in Vietnam? And how do you reconcile that?
I wouldn't say that I'm homeless. I think I have homes, you know. But when I think of home, when I think of home, I think of growing up in San Jose in the 1970s and 1980s and feeling like I was a spy in my parents' household because they were Vietnamese and I was becoming Americanized. I thought, who are these strange Vietnamese people? Why are we eating this strange food? And then I would go out into the American world and I would think, I'm a Vietnamese person. Who are these strange American people and why do they do the things that they do? Why do they call their parents by their first names? Like, this is weird, you know? And so home was always, yes, home was home in the conventional sense, but home was always also a place of discomfort. And there was always friction between these two senses of home. And that has never gone away. So I feel like I have homes, but for me, a home is a very complex, ambivalent kind of phenomenon. And I think that most people don't want to have that sensation. Most people want to have the home where they feel at home. Right. You know, but I think if, as a writer, when you feel at home, you're dead. You know, it's good for a writer to feel uncomfortable. I mean, so for me, I have to cultivate that. I have to cultivate being that refugee and feeling uncomfortable and feeling like a spy so that I can have something to write about.
Okay. So the theme of
I'm spying on all of you. Yeah.
I think you should just interview yourself.
Oh, really? Okay. I've done that. I have done that. It's very strange.
I have no doubt. All right. So the theme of duality, appearing one way, really being another way, runs throughout the book. Even the sympathizer, he's a sympathizer because he's really Viet Cong, but he's infiltrated the South, but he's actually a sympathetic person. He loves his mother. He is very loyal to his childhood friends. He's neither good nor bad. He's used the word ambiguous a minute ago. So how did that come about, that theme of duality? How did you choose to write the story in that way?
Well, I think on the one hand, duality is universal. I think all of us at one point or another in our lives have felt that we don't fit in somewhere and that we have to wear a mask in order to fit in with our family or work or whatever. That's universal, all right? But if you are a refugee or a minority or someone who's displaced, but when I say minority, I don't just mean a racial minority. I mean, like, you could be disabled, you could be gay or whatever. That condition of duality is greatly exaggerated. And you know, W.E.B. Du Bois summed it up wonderfully in 1903, I think, or 1899, in The Souls of Black Folk, when talking about the condition of African Americans or Negroes, when he said, you know, to be black in this country, to be Negro in this country, is to always look at yourself through two sets of eyes, your own eyes and the eyes of white people or dominant society. And I think that is a condition of duality that I grew up with, the much more exaggerated sense that I was living two lives. And that my parents weren't aware of my American life and my American friends weren't aware of my Vietnamese life. And that was very evident to me, not just in my own circumstance, but in thinking about what it meant to be Vietnamese in American society. Because I was very precocious, I was reading and I was watching a lot of movies, I was very curious about what had brought me to this country, even as a kid. So by 10 years old or 11 years old, I was watching Apocalypse Now, for example, on the VCR, you know. And I watched almost every movie that Hollywood made about the Vietnam War, which is an exercise I don't recommend to anybody, okay? Because, especially as a Vietnamese person, because as a Vietnamese person, I rapidly realized that the only place for a Vietnamese person in these movies was to be silent, to be shot, to be killed, to be raped, to be rescued, and then if we had anything to say at all, we were to say thank you. And that just wasn't my experience of being Vietnamese, because I could look around my family and the Vietnamese refugee community in San Jose, and we had a multiplicity of stories that were so much more complex. They were as complex as the stories Americans were telling themselves about anything. But American society didn't know any of that kind of stuff, you know? And that was sort of the beginning, my beginning as a writer. My sense that my understanding of the American story and the Vietnamese story was radically different than the American understanding of it, and that it was going to be my task to somehow tell these stories myself.
So you referenced Apocalypse Now, and there's that extended section in the book where our narrator goes off to be an advisor on a film of an auteurist, maybe Francis Ford Coppola, maybe not, but basically an amalgamation of a number of themes around the American experience and the American experience of the war in Vietnam. And yes, the narrator does sort of stick up for the extras who are the legitimate people, not just the hired actors. But one of the things that was interesting to me was I watched Apocalypse Now actually in the theater because that's how old I am. And I remember the first movie that I ever saw that told a slightly different story about Vietnam was something called Casualties of War, where it's a Brian De Palma film. It was based on a true incident where, as an act of vengeance, a group of soldiers kidnap a Vietnamese girl, take her off, brutalize her, and ultimately murder her. And I thought, wow, that's kind of interesting, because up to that point, most of the movies were sort of more heroic. The interventionist was appropriate and good, even though the country was still very divided about how it felt about the war itself and how it was waged and soldiers coming home. So, but you've written a lot about movies and the soft power of movies. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, and I think well, I mean, basically what I say is that the Vietnam War is something that Americans lost in fact, but have won in memory. You know, this is like this is maybe the only circumstance in history where the losers get to write history instead of the victors. So, I mean, if you go to Vietnam, obviously the victors write the history in Vietnam. But unless you go to Vietnam, you're never going to encounter that, because the Vietnamese can't export their memories, except on the art house circuit. And even there, you know, people barely watch it. But because of American soft power, because of the American cultural industry, which is basically the unofficial ministry of propaganda for this country, American memories become global memories. This is a privilege that Americans take for granted. You know, that Apocalypse Now is something that everybody watches. You go to Vietnam and people watch American movies about the Vietnam War in Vietnam, okay? And anywhere I go, when I was researching Nothing Ever Dies, and people learned that I was writing about this war, they were like, have you seen Apocalypse Now? And so that is what we're up against,
right.
That Hollywood is the equivalent of the Pentagon. You know, the American capacity to kill 3 million people overseas and only lose 58,000 American lives is matched by the American capacity to send its movies all over the world. It's the same technology, it's the same ideology, and you don't need an official ministry of propaganda, because the people in Hollywood accept the ideology that the people in the Pentagon do. That's how ideology works in this country. And so for me to write this novel was, in my own small way, my attempt to both reveal this in operation and to take revenge on Hollywood. You know, and I know that I'm in a losing battle, because this novel is only going to be read by so many people, and I can only do so much in terms of trying to affect this kind of change. But to even say that much out loud seems to take people by surprise, because I think Americans take this so much for granted that they haven't even thought about the fact that Hollywood exercises this much power, and its gears are geared with the military-industrial complex. It is a part of the military-industrial complex.
So you're not looking for Francis Ford Coppola to do the movie version of the book?
I thought about Sofia Coppola. I thought that would be justice.
That would work.
You know, yeah.
That would work. The book is also full of really, really great quotes. The best kind of truth, the one that means at least two things. It's always better to admire the best among our foes rather than the worst among our friends, which is very like sort of keep your friends close, but your enemy's closer, that kind of wariness that maybe comes from the refugee experience. And then one of my favorites, don't you see that Americans need the anti-American? While it's better to be loved than hated, it's also better to be hated than ignored. Do you think that's still true?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I think that's the privilege of being an imperial power. Obviously, many Americans wouldn't agree with being called an imperial power, but you are, or we are. I am. I'm a part of it now, too. And we're a different kind of empire. You know, we're not the kind of empire that has to take over countries, although we have taken over countries. We're the kind of empire that works its power through building 800 plus military bases in foreign countries, which we would never allow to happen in our own country. Imagine if there was an Italian air base here next to the Pentagon. It would never happen. But we take it for granted that we can go anywhere in the world and put an air base or naval base or something like that, you know? And that just, I think of myself as someone who is writing about the Vietnam War and does not retreat from writing about the Vietnam War, but I need to recast the terms. Because if I only wrote about the Vietnam War, I'd be that Vietnamese guy who writes about the Vietnam War, which is what people expect from someone like me. But for me to write the Sympathizer and Nothing Ever Dies, it's a very conscious project to say, what's really important is not just the Vietnam War. From an American perspective, what's really important is to acknowledge that the Vietnam War is just one episode in 150 years of an American effort to expand the United States from the 13 colonies to California and then across the Pacific to get to China, which was always the goal. You know, and Vietnam was simply one part of that goal, to expand American capitalism and protect global capitalism, okay? And that's my understanding of war, and that's what I write about. My understanding of war is that we live in the forever war. We live in a military-industrial complex. We live in a time of war as a condition, not war as an event. So whatever's happening in Iraq, Afghanistan, the Middle East, these are simply more episodes in the forever war and of war as a condition. That's what I'm writing about.
Mm-hmm. There are threads of the American experience throughout the book, and I've heard it variously described as the greatest American novel, the great Vietnamese novel, the great anti-American novel. Is it any one of the above? Is it all three? How do you feel about that?
Yeah, it's everything. I mean, it's like, I think that even each of us, you know, we have multiple identities. And I bring this up because oftentimes, you know, I'll be asked, are you Vietnamese? Are you American? Are you a Vietnamese writer or an Asian American writer or an American writer? And I don't retreat from any of those things. I'm all of those things. We're all many things at the same time. And this novel is many things at the same time. So I hope it's all of those things, and I hope it's just a great novel, period, or at least a good novel. You know, at least that much. Yeah. Thank you. I was asking for that, but thank you.
Well, the other great thing about it, though, it's many things. It's a spy story. It's a love story. It's some of the material was based on true characters, or at least people who were. You want to talk a little bit about that? That not necessarily the model for the spy, but there were people in Vietnam who rose to high levels being spies. Can you talk about that?
Actually, almost the entire novel, in terms of all the major events and all the major characters, are true. For example, obviously the fall of Saigon happened. Obviously there was a movie like Apocalypse Now. There actually really was a plot to try to take back Vietnam, run by former South Vietnamese soldiers, and it was really run out of Thailand. And there were rumors that the first Vietnamese international pho chain was started in order to fund the revolution.
Wow.
And they're really one of the most famous Vietnamese generals really did open a liquor store in Southern California and was rumored to have connections to this counter-revolutionary effort. And many of the major figures were inspired, like that Vietnamese general is a composite figure. And Lana, the singer, is based on Linda Giang Dai, the Vietnamese Madonna of the Vietnamese, pop culture industry. And so it was like a lot of fun to write the novel because I could draw on all these things that I was growing up with, that I was reading about, or that I had heard about. What is fictional is the inner life of the protagonist. He's loosely inspired by Pham Xuan Anh, who was a Vietnamese spy who actually came to the United States and studied in Orange County in the 1950s and came back to Saigon and was so successful that while he was working as a spy, he was clandestinely promoted to Major General in the North Vietnamese military because he was that good, and was friends with all the major American journalists who were completely shocked when it was revealed that he was a spy in the 1980s. But the inner life, his inner life and his ambiguities and his contradictions, that I made up, that I imagined. And that is what gives the emotional and intellectual force of the novel.
And the re-education scenes, I found them very difficult, obviously necessary for the course of the book, but your experience of that was not direct, but you clearly did a lot of research, and how did that come together in the book?
You know, there are now accounts of what life was like in the re-education camps by survivors of these camps, and so some of the bare-bones details of what the camp was like and are accounted for. But actually, once you get to that camp sequence in the last quarter of the novel, most of it is made up. Because I actually was not interested in the specificity of the camp. Like, I wasn't interested in, like, how do you get there, where is it, how does the camp operate, that kind of stuff. Because that sequence at the end is really crucial to the novel, because even though it takes place in a material environment, a physical setting, it's all within his own mind, really. I mean, he's being interrogated, and it's not a physical, it's not like they're torturing him, they're not like breaking him on the rack or something. It's all psychological, it's like sleep deprivation, right? And that was really crucial because I wanted that camp scene to be surreal. So it's set in a wasteland, which is a very deliberate evocation of Eliot's The Wasteland, which is invoked on the very first page of the novel. And it's all about his mentality, and it's all about the structure of power between the interrogator and the person who's being interrogated. And it's all about what happens when the Vietnamese turn on each other. Right. It's revolutionaries turning on each other. And so there I was not that interested in all the details that I learned about how these guys, we know, were physically broken through harsh labor and all that other kind of stuff. I was much more interested in trying to make up what was happening in his own mind. And that was both very difficult, as you said. You know, it's difficult to read, it's difficult to write. But it was also a lot of fun.
Right.
Because it was a technical challenge.
Right.
I was like, oh, I'm going to have to like torture this guy for 100 pages.
Right.
And I have to make the reader want to read at the same time. How do I pull that off?
Right.
You know. So unfortunately, even though I had some sleepless nights, I was also like laughing as I was writing. I was like, oh, this is fun. This is cool. You know?
Well, you also had that lovely riddle of the Sphinx. You know, nothing is more precious than freedom and independence. And what was the genesis for that?
Well, nothing is more precious than independence and freedom is a very famous slogan. It was coined by Ho Chi Minh. And it was used to motivate the North Vietnamese during their war. And, you know, literally, you know, hundreds of thousands of people died for that slogan. And they really believed in it. And the North Vietnamese really believed that that's what they were doing because that was the propaganda that they were being fed, that they were being told, you know, South Vietnam is being occupied by these foreigners and our South Vietnamese brothers and sisters are living under slavery and we have to go and liberate them. And people, you know, sacrificed everything to pull that off. Then they win, and then lo and behold, it's not what they were told. They get to South Vietnam and they think, well, it's actually not that bad. You know, they have flush toilets, they have radios, you know, that kind of stuff. And then liberated Vietnam, the North Vietnamese, according to all counts, most people really lived under high conditions of idealism, revolutionary idealism. And then the reality after the war was that they got disillusioned. Everybody had sacrificed so much, and then they won, and then they became capitalists. You know, like, this is what this is what 3 million people died for. You know, we threw off capitalism in order to become capitalists. And so when I got there in 2002, the country had officially changed its economic program. It had gone from economic collectivism to opening the doors to global capitalism in 1986. So by 2002, economic renovation was well underway. And one of the jokes I heard was the joke that became the joke in this novel, the final joke in the novel. I had heard it, and I thought, this is kind of funny. It's a black comedy. And I just put it away in my memory banks. And then when I wrote the novel, I didn't intend to put that joke in. But I got to that point in the novel and I thought, this makes perfect sense. Because the whole novel is at least partially a joke. And it's about the absurdity of what happens under ideologically extreme situations. And this is the most absurd joke of all. The joke is about nothing, you know, and about the multiple meanings, or at least the dual meanings of nothing. Right. And he's forced to confront that, the nothingness of revolution.
Right. No. No, it was just the whole last part, as I said, was difficult to read, but...
You should still read it, though. It's still really entertaining. There's a lot of jokes involved.
Yes. Okay. So I want to talk about the writing life for a few minutes. You said as a child you were a voracious reader, precocious, and at what point did the writing life just, choose you?
Second or third grade, I think. I was a refugee child, and I was going to this public elementary school in downtown San Jose, and there was and one of the things that we did, and here I have to say, bless the librarians, okay, because we, as little kids, had the opportunity to write our own books. So I wrote my own book, a picture book, drew the pictures, wrote the words, bound the book, did the cover. It was called Lester the Cat. It was about a city cat who got sick and tired of city life and fled to this country. Even back then, I understood basic mythology, urban, rural, alienation. He goes to the country, he finds love with a girl cat. It would have been really radical if it was a boy cat, but I wasn't that far ahead. And he stays in the countryside, and I got a little prize for that. And then we got taken to the big public library, and my parents were refugee shopkeepers working to 12 to 14 hours a day. They weren't going to take me to a book awards ceremony, so the school librarian took me.
Oh, wow.
On a weekend. I don't remember her name, but I remember her face very vividly. She looked a little bit like you, and so, and I thought, and I. That's true. It's true. It literally is.
You're killing me.
It is true.
Okay.
But this is why whenever I go to meet librarians, it's really true. I mean, librarians have big supporters of this book, but they also made a huge difference to me when I was a kid. And so the book won a prize, and I put it into my little mind at that time this idea that books could be cool, writing could be cool, And so and the library was my second home, because my parents were working all the time. I was a latchkey kid, and so by 10, I knew how to take the public bus to go to the library and go there every weekend and go home with a backpack full of books, and that would last me for 1 week, and then I'd go back and get another backpack full of books.
And it sounds like you read across all genres, science fiction, spy stuff, pornography, sure.
Yeah, no, I mean seriously.
Why not?
I mean, I totally understand this as a parent myself. I'm shocked that the public library would have pornography, but it did. So there was no boundaries between the children's section and young adult and pornography. And literally, I would go and I would find these paperbacks, and they would be like, hard-boiled detective fiction with softcore pornography. Or, I remember this too, Mac Bolan, Executioner.
Yeah.
Mac Bolan was a Special Forces Green Beret who comes back after the mafia wipes out his family and turns his sister into a prostitute, and he goes back to take revenge on the mafia. I read this book, I was like maybe 10. I'm serious. I know this because my brother was still at home and he was 7 years older, so he hadn't gone to college yet. I go home and I say, hey, what's a prostitute? Is that like a Protestant? And he said, go to the dictionary. But that was the kind of stuff I was reading.
That's great.
Yeah.
I've never had a conversation like this. All right, so the Refugees is the new collection of short stories, and we're going to ask our guest to read a little bit from it in a few minutes. But I was struck, I read something that the very first story, Black-Eyed Woman, was something that took you 17 years and 50 drafts to write. And I'm just interested in, wow.
I'm tearing up because, no, I mean, it was a very, 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 very difficult story to write. So I got my PhD in 97, and then I got a job at USC. And so the summer of 97, I was in LA getting ready, but I'd always wanted to be a writer, and I'd been writing through undergraduate and graduate years, and I thought, okay, before my career begins, I'm going to spend the summer writing a short story collection. And I did. I wrote a very bad short story collection that summer, and one of the stories was what eventually became Black-Eyed Women. So that was when I first put the words down for this book, and I had no idea it wouldn't be until 2014 that I would finish this book. And if I had known that, I probably would never. I was like, no way. You know, I couldn't even imagine 17 years at that point in my life. I was 26, and but 50 drafts, and because that story almost broke me as a writer, and because it didn't break me as a writer, I became a writer, and I learned how to write by writing the stories in this collection, and especially through writing that story. Because I took a few writing workshops, but I never did an MFA, didn't really have many mentors or teachers, so I just learned by doing, which is one reason why it took so long. And I think for short stories, the thing is that I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't understand like the art of the short story. And the one thing that I probably did not understand most about a short story was that less is more. Because if you read The Sympathizer, it's all about more is more. You know, like lots of stuff is happening in that book, and that's my natural instinct. So for 17 years, I had to learn how to, rein myself in and put myself into these very small packages in the short story. That was very, very hard for me to do.
But The Sympathizer only took you a couple of years.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. But you know what? I think so. In some ways, writing that novel felt to me like as if I found my natural form in the novel. But I think that was only really because, and it is my natural form, but I think it's really only because I spent 17 years struggling with a short story. If I had started off writing a novel, I probably would have spent 17 years writing a novel too.
That's true. Fair.
But it was like the Karate Kid, wax on, wax off. Like, why am I doing this for 17 years? And then all of a sudden, I get the real test. Mm-hmm. And I could do it. Mm-hmm. So it was a very magical moment where the 17 years of preparation, of suffering, had gotten me ready for that big moment against or with the greatest challenge of my life. Mm-hmm.
There's also a character of a ghost in the story, and there were ghosts in The Sympathizer, the Crapo Major and Sonny. And so what about the ghost? What about that symbol in your culture or in your writing? Why is it important?
Well, I mean, ghosts are literally important in Vietnamese culture, and apparently in American culture too. I mean, a lot of Americans believe in ghosts as well, but ghosts function, I think, a little bit differently in Vietnamese culture. There's certainly the ghosts that you're scared of, the ghosts that are coming back to take revenge for whatever reason. But Vietnamese people also believe that ghosts appear benevolently, like they will die and then they will appear to say goodbye. Mm-hmm. Okay, and I've heard those stories fairly often, and they're not threatening ghosts. They just, they just appear to say farewell. And I think Vietnamese people find that reassuring because that's a signal that there's really an afterlife and the ghost is on his or her way there and will eventually join this person. And I wanted to do that in this story. I wanted to write about benevolent ghosts rather than scary ghosts. My wife is a professor of film and she watches a lot of Asian horror. And those ghosts are out to kill you, So I'm like, I don't want to. When she watches those films, I go into the bedroom and I shut the door. So I don't write about those kinds of things. I'm easily scared. But I wanted to write about these ghosts. And these ghosts, I also want to write about them because the sociologist Avery Gordon has a book called Ghostly Matters. And in that book, she argues that when ghosts appear, they are a sign that justice has not been done. Mm-hmm. The ghost has died because some injustice has happened. Now, in the American version, it's because something happened last summer in the sorority house, okay? But there is a political and historical dimension to this. So Beloved is about a ghost, and obviously the injustice is slavery. Americans haven't dealt with slavery, right? And likewise, the ghost in this story is a manifestation that history is not finished. Mm-hmm. The experience of the oceanic refugees is not finished for the people who lived and died through that. That's what happens when the ghost appears. Okay.
So you mentioned a minute ago that you didn't do an MFA program and workshops, and you wrote a piece in the New York Times not too long ago where you were fairly critical of the Iowa workshop kind of experience. Can you talk a little bit about that? You had issues of, literature is power and how those workshops are particularly unfavorable to minorities, people of color, women.
Right. Well, I think I've alienated a lot of people who've gotten the MFA. Basically my thing is I follow Flannery O'Connor. She went to Iowa workshop and she came out of it saying, workshops are a case of the blind leading the blind. Okay, and I believe in that. Like, I mean, the writing, I don't know how many of you know what the writing workshop is. It's the master writer and a dozen or 15 students, and the master writer stays silent while the dozen or 15 students gang up on another student. Okay, now for some people, this workshop works really well as a method, and that's great. For me, it didn't, because I thought, I'm paying this much money to hear from you, this undergraduate I don't respect. I want to speak to the master. And so, for me, the issue with the writing workshop first is pedagogical. Like, why is this the only pedagogical model offered? Let's do a variety of different things. But the second issue is that in this writing workshop, because so much of it is run through unquestioned assumptions, all the other prejudices and assumptions that we carry with us as people are brought into the workshop as well. And in the workshop, certain kinds of aesthetic notions are offered as universals. Show, don't tell is what I took on. Right. And people just go around saying, show, don't tell, show, don't tell. Why? They just say it as if it's like the first commandment, when it's just an aesthetic notion that has a particular historical grounding in the United States of the contemporary moment. Show, don't tell is the dominant aesthetic of contemporary American fiction. I don't like contemporary American fiction. I like some of it. But a lot of it is just middle-brow literary realism that reiterates dominant ideological thinking in the United States. Going back to that notion that Hollywood is a part of the military-industrial complex, okay? The people in Hollywood don't know that they're a part of the military-industrial complex. Michael Bay makes Transformers 7 or 8 or whatever it is, and it's just entertainment when it's actually just another function of the military-industrial complex. Likewise, the people out of the writing workshop, some of them produce great art, and a lot of them are just producing another novel that reiterates middle-brow literary realism about cancer survivors, or whatever. I mean, cancer is important, yes, but it's not like the only thing, or divorce, or whatever that we have to talk about. So, show, don't tell was not useful for me as someone who wanted to talk about ideology and politics, because show, don't tell makes it really difficult to talk about ideology and politics and history and theory and philosophy, because how do you show, don't tell about philosophy? I mean, like Kant, Wittgenstein, Marx, they told you a lot of stuff, And so then that's why a lot of contemporary American fiction is not philosophical. You have to turn to European fiction to get philosophical or theoretical. They don't have a problem with that. Americans do. And so the writing workshop obscures all of that and makes it very difficult to talk about certain things in American fiction.
So you figured out how to do that, regardless of how long it took you to get there. So your advice to a young writer who is so inclined to be cognizant of history and ideas and philosophy in their writing, what would you suggest that they do?
I don't know. I mean, I'm kind of an idiosyncratic polemicist, so I would never say do what I did, because it took 20 years to do what I did. And the thing with the MFA workshop, just like the PhD that I did, is that it's a part of an institution. I spent 5 years getting a PhD, and it institutionalized me in both good and bad ways. The good way is that I got a job, and I know the rhetoric of academia, and I know how to survive and all that kind of stuff. But it institutionalized me, as it did many others, because it meant after 5 years, I couldn't speak a language that anybody else understood besides my fellow academics, okay? And you cannot get academics to understand this. They're like, what? We don't speak clearly? What are you talking about? Because they only speak to each other.
Right.
So likewise, if you get an MFA, it's good and bad. You're a part of the institution, which means you can get a job in another institution that has MFAs. And you don't understand why, if you produce a certain kind of literary novel, nobody besides 500 people might want to read the book.
Okay.
But you'll get a job, and you'll get recognition, in the literary world. So you can do that route. Or you can do that and try to do something else. Expose yourself to other things. Read theory, read philosophy, read European fiction, read literature in translation. Don't just read what gets published in the New Yorker and think that that's the end of it, right? But it's very hard, because obviously when you're 25 or years old and you're trying to get an MFA and you're struggling with being a writer, you're just trying to make your own identity and make yourself into a writer. And there's all these worldly pressures on you, and I felt that too. I wanted to be published in the New Yorker, and now I've never been published in the New Yorker. I'm like, well, I don't need the New Yorker, but If 10 years ago they would have given me an offer, I'd be like, yes, I'll do whatever you want, give it to me. So it's I understand all these pressures and these demands, and so that's why I can't just sort of tell people to do what I did.
No, I was just curious because you obviously have been successful, and this other model is so overwhelming, probably part of the military-industrial complex. Regardless, why fiction matters is our theme for Arlington Reads. Elizabeth Strout spoke to that a couple of weeks ago. Why do you think fiction matters?
When I was growing up in downtown San Jose, my parents opened the second Vietnamese grocery store in downtown. I was walking on that street where my parents had their grocery store. I was 10 or 11 or 12 or whatever. And in another store window, I saw a sign. And it said, "Another American driven out of business by the Vietnamese." And even at that age, I understood this was a story. And it was a story that didn't include my parents, and it didn't include me. Or it included us to the extent that it wanted to get rid of us, to exclude us. So I understood it was a very powerful story, and it took me a long time to try to understand that story, to make sense out of it. I had to go to college, go to Berkeley, get radicalized, to connect that sign. It's a stereotype, but it's true, I could, after my education at Berkeley, I could connect that sign to a much longer and wider history of how it is that this country has behaved abominably towards Asians, both Asian immigrants and refugees who have come to this country and Asians elsewhere that we have bombed as a country. So I understood innately or intuitively the power of stories at this point. And I understood that I could become a storyteller. I needed to become a storyteller in order to contest that story. And that fiction was important. Poetry is important too. Many kinds of stories are important. For me, my métier is fiction. This is why fiction matters. It matters because it's emotionally important to those of us who are writers, but it matters because it tells a story that has political significance too. Mm-hmm. That's why I think of myself as a political writer. So I was getting ready to contest another American driven out of business by the Vietnamese, knowing that that story would get repeated again eventually one day as Make America Great Again. Mm-hmm. Make America Great Again is another version of another American driven out of business by the Vietnamese. Right. And I spent my life getting ready to fight that story. They didn't cheer me in Clemson when I said that line. South Carolina is a different state.
Yes, in many ways.
Yeah.
Would you read a little bit?
Absolutely.
We're going to read a little bit, and then we're going to take questions from all of you.
Now, it took me about 5 years to write this page and a half. It'll take me about 2 or 3 minutes, and you as well. Just remember that. Black-eyed women. Fame would strike someone, usually the kind that healthy-minded people would not wish upon themselves, such as being kidnapped and kept prisoner for years, suffering humiliation in a sex scandal, or surviving something typically fatal. These survivors needed someone to help write their memoirs, and their agents might eventually come across me. "At least your name's not on anything," my mother once said. When I mentioned that I would not mind being thanked in the acknowledgments, she said, "Let me tell you a story." It would be the first time I heard this story, but not the last. "In our homeland," she went on, "there was a reporter who said the government tortured the people in prison. So the government does to him exactly what he said they did to others. They send him away and no one ever sees him again. That's what happens to writers who put their names on things." By the time Victor Devoto chose me, I had resigned myself to being one of those writers whose names did not appear on book covers. His agent had given him a book that I had ghostwritten. Its ostensible author, the father of a boy who had shot and killed several people at his school. "I identify with the father's guilt," Victor said to me. He was the sole survivor of an airplane crash, 173 others having perished, including his wife and children. What was left of him appeared on all the talk shows, his body there, but not much else. The voice was a soft monotone, and the eyes, on the occasions they looked up, seemed to hold within them the silhouettes of mournful people. His publisher said that it was urgent that he finish his story while audiences still remembered the tragedy. And this was my preoccupation on the day my dead brother returned to me. My mother woke me while it was still dark outside and said, "Don't be afraid." Through my open door, the light from the hallway stung. Why would I be afraid? When she said my brother's name, I did not think of my brother. He had died long ago. I closed my eyes and said I did not know anyone by that name, but she persisted. "He's here to see us," she said, stripping off my covers and tugging at me until I rose, eyes half shut. She was 63, moderately forgetful, and when she led me to the living room and cried out, I was not surprised. "He was right here," she said, kneeling by her floral armchair as she felt the carpet. "It's wet." She crawled to the front door in her cotton pajamas, following the trail. When I touched the carpet, it was damp. For a moment, I twitched in belief, and the silence of the house at 4 a.m. felt ominous. Then I noticed a sound of rainwater in the gutters, and the fear that had gripped my neck relaxed its hold. My mother must have opened the door, gotten drenched, then come back inside. I knelt by her as she crouched next to the door, her hand on the knob, and said, "You're imagining things." I know what I saw. Brushing my hand off her shoulder, she stood up, anger illuminating her dark eyes. "He walked, he talked, he wanted to see you." "Then where is he, Ma? I don't see anyone." "Of course you don't," she sighed, as if I were the one, unable to grasp the obvious. "He's a ghost, isn't he?" Thank you.
Thank you. Beautiful. Ready for some questions? Yes, sir.
Forgive me if I'm wrong about the seeming work you've done reading the work of Hun Ngoc, the Vietnamese historian. I wonder whether I'm right about that and whether you would put in a little plug for his writing as a historian from the Vietnamese perspective.
Yeah, I have a book like this thick. I think it's Wandering Through Cultures that he did. And so he is certainly, when you go to Vietnam, one of those people you see in tourist bookstores, for example, and he's become sort of the official government figure of cultural translation, the Vietnamese ambassador between Vietnam and foreigners, basically. So his work is very good in that regard of introducing that part of Vietnamese culture to foreigners. You might also want to look at the work of Yung Tu Hung, who is the person that the Vietnamese government doesn't want you to read, so much so that they banished her to France. So novels like Paradise of the Blind and Novel Without a Name and Memories of a Pure Spring I found to be very illuminating because they talk about the other side of Vietnamese culture that's not so pleasant, the contradictions of Vietnamese communism and so on. And she herself was a Northern Vietnamese war veteran and Communist Party member who turned against the party, right, and decided to speak a different truth about Vietnamese culture than Hun Ngoc did. Yes, sir.
What did you think of the movie Coming Home, John Voight, Jane Fonda?
What did I think of the movie Coming Home, John Voight, Jane Fonda? I teach a course on the Vietnam War, and I show a clip from that movie because it's one of the few American movies that acknowledges that war isn't something that's simply fought over there, but it's something that comes back at home. And that war involves the home front, war involves spouses and partners and children and all these kinds of things. And so it's a film that begins to show us that the costs of war are not just on the battlefront, but that soldiers bear these costs when they come home. And families bear these costs as well. And that when we go to look at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial and we see 58,000 plus American names on that wall of the soldiers who died, we forget all those soldiers who died after the war. Agent Orange, suicide, homelessness, all these things. We don't build war memorials to that, or soldiers' memorials to that, because it would just be too uncomfortable to think that war isn't something that's simply over there, but war is something that we bring back with us too.
You know, when you were describing the character of man at the end, whose body had been horribly disfigured, and napalm, I guess, was I couldn't get the whole Robert Duvall, the smell of napalm in the morning out of my head. So it just was an interesting twist on that particular line. We have some questions from the folks out in the lobby. I'll read one of them. In the Sympathizer, what's the significance of the fact that so few characters' names are revealed?
Well, I mean, at one level, it's revealed for us when our protagonist goes to Bangkok and finally gets to see the Hamlet, the movie that he worked on. And he watches it, and then he waits for his name in the credits. And he sees the credits roll, and there are no Vietnamese names. Instead, the Vietnamese appear as VC rapist number 1, VC rapist number 2, VC rapist number 3, crazy guy in whorehouse. And then he's waiting, so where's my name? He never even appears. So again, like, Vietnamese people are nameless. We're anonymous in Western culture, in Hollywood, right? And so that was a joke in that regard, that there are no names for these people. But also, I realized when I was writing the novel that I wanted the novel to be about Vietnam and about the Vietnam War, and I also wanted it to be a universal novel. And I knew that if I put in all these Vietnamese names in this book, that it would not be a universal novel. The Vietnamese people would get it. No one else would. People would be like, what? What's his name? How do you spell this name? I can't even remember. People can't even remember my name, much less 10 Vietnamese names. I can't remember 10 Vietnamese names. You take me to, I went home for the first time, to meet all my relatives, like 25 people coming out at me. I was like, who are you? I can't remember all these names. So I deliberately erased all those names in order to increase the ability of non-Vietnamese people to identify with the characters in this book. And so that was a strategic maneuver.
Do your parents still use their Vietnamese names, or did they adopt American names?
So strangely, my parents, who said we're 100% Vietnamese, changed their names. So now they're Joseph and Linda. To Americans. Now, to other Vietnamese people, they have their Vietnamese names, And I had the opportunity to change my name into an American name when I got my citizenship. And strangely enough, me, the Vietnamese American, Americanized person, could not change his name.
Oh.
I tried out different names. Troy. I was like, that doesn't sound right. Nothing sounded right. And so that invisible brand stamped between my shoulder blades of being a Vietnamese refugee stayed with me, and I just couldn't give up my name.
Yeah, that's great. How about in the back? Yes, ma'am. Yes.
How did you feel when you got the Pulitzer Prize?
Well, I mean, literally, how did I feel? I felt shock. I was in a Cambridge, Massachusetts hotel room doing my Facebook or whatever, emails and all that glamorous stuff you do on book tour. And suddenly Facebook and Twitter started making all this noise. And I looked at it and I was like, what? WTF? And then first I called my wife and I said, I think I won the Pulitzer Prize. And then I called my publicist and I said, did I win the Pulitzer Prize? And she looked on the website, the Pulitzer website, and she said, you won the Pulitzer Prize! And I was like, and then I was like, this sucks, because I'm in a hotel room and my wife and son are in California, and this is like one of the most important moments of my life.
Sure.
And I was like, what? So I sent out on Facebook and said, this is a wonderful moment of my life. I'm stuck in a hotel room in Cambridge. What should I do? And a friend of mine emailed me back and he said, you should listen to Champagne Life by Neo. And that's what I did. And so it was a mixture of like shock and dancing by myself in this hotel room, which I will not reenact for you in the present, and then having to go out 2 hours later, an hour later, to do a book event at the Harvard bookstore. And literally I knew that my value had changed because people looked at me differently. Actually, no. I mean, what happened was the first thing I had to do, I had to go have a drink with Claire Massoud and James Wood. You know, and all of a sudden they were just going to have a drink with Viet. And then I was like, oh, it's Viet, the Pulitzer Prize winner, all of a sudden. And so it was shock, it was numbness, it was weirdness, and it took several months for that to wear off before it finally sunk in that I won the Pulitzer Prize, and I better do something with this. And it's not just about me, you know, and that was very, very important to me, you know, because I'm not a believer in this idea of individualism which dominates in American literature, you know. Like, American literature is a competition of individuals. And for me, my entry into literature was that it could save my life. I mean, like, my parents were killing themselves working in this store, and I was going to the library to read to save my life. And then I went to Berkeley, and I became an English major, but that was just for fun. I mean, there was no way I was going to go home to my parents, who were working 12 to 14 hours a day, and say, hey, you know what, I'm just going to study Jane Austen and the Romantics. And so it was by becoming an ethnic studies major and seeing that, you know, literature really did save lives and had a political purpose, and that, you know, literature connected me to collectivities and solidarities, that meant that I could become a scholar and a writer. So winning the Pulitzer Prize, the reason why it was important to me, well, yes, I could cash out, but also I could use it to work through this mission of the collective and the solidarity of using literature as transformation. And that's what the Pulitzer meant to me in the long run.
Right. Yes, please.
Thank you so much. 2 quick questions. Your central character and the sympathizer identifies himself and characterizes himself as a bastard. Did you mean that, sir, to symbolize precisely the impact of colonialism, where your own native culture does not quite accept you, and also the foreign culture that has dominated and owned you also does not really accept you thoroughly? Is that therefore a satirical sort of symbolism?
Can I just answer that? No, that's a complicated question. Can I answer it before you ask your second question? Because I'm going to forget. So the question was, my protagonist is a bastard in the novel, called a bastard. Is that symbolic of colonialism and everything else? And yes, you know, I mean, I wrote The Refugees, and it was mostly about Vietnamese people, even though there were non-Vietnamese people in there. And I was already pushing against this idea that because I was Vietnamese, I had to write about Vietnamese people. And it was very important to me to write about Vietnamese people. But I also knew that Vietnamese people, it was important for me to write about Vietnamese people because we've been subjected to racism here and exclusion at home from the victorious communists. But knowing Vietnamese people very well, I also knew that Vietnamese people are racist themselves. So sadly, ironically, the people against whom racism is done are also racist themselves. And what that meant was that simply to, you're Vietnamese, right? You're saying, yeah, that's right, you know. I love mom and dad, but they're racist, you know. Yeah. And so what that meant was that it was not enough to simply affirm Vietnamese people. That I wanted to create a character who would make Vietnamese people question their own racism. And if you know anything about mixed race people in Vietnam, you know that they're subject to intense racism in Vietnam. And so there was a pragmatic function to that. But obviously, to make my character a bastard, a mixed race person, was to make very literal the whole East is East and West is West and never the twain shall meet. So then logically, I could exploit all of these cultural differences and conflicts that were going to come up. It also made possible for me to acknowledge this very old and tired metaphor that colonialism is rape. Both at the national level and at the very immediate personal level, colonialism is rape. And my character is born from at least molestation, you know, French priest, underage Vietnamese girl. And then finally, again, what it made possible for me was to constantly undermine assumptions about identity. You know, that we are 100% Vietnamese, for example, what my dad always told me. I thought, that's wrong. Because if I go back far enough, if I do a DNA test, I'm probably going to find some Chinese people in there somewhere, you know. And that was also part of the function of making him a mixed race character too.
The other very quick question is, you're clearly a very gifted storyteller. How does storytelling, or the gift of storytelling, help in making a better writer?
How does the gift of storytelling help in making a better writer? Well, if you don't have a gift of storytelling, you're not going to be a writer, I think. Well, I mean, like I'm also an academic. And, academics generally don't know how to tell stories. We get up here and we lecture you, and here's point A, point B, and all that kind of stuff. And so storytelling makes things go down easier. So, I mean, in Sympathizer, it's very clear that it's a political novel. I want to score my political points and my historical points and everything in there. But if I just told you what that stuff is, you'd be like, oh, that's just Viet the professor, writing a bad novel. So I had to use storytelling. I had to figure out the right storytelling mechanism in order to make these points plausible and make people accept the points even as I'm saying things. Like I say stuff in this novel that if you're an American reader is like really outrageous, apparently, from what Americans are telling me. What? Hollywood? You're saying Hollywood is not, you're saying Hollywood is like worse than Joseph Goebbels and the Nazis? I mean, there's a line in my novel where I literally say that, So how do I say that and make Americans accept it at the same time? Storytelling, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Right.
Yes, sir.
Excuse me. I'm sorry I didn't get in here until about half, but I was wondering, are there anybody are there any characters like the characters, two questions, any characters in real life, like the main character, the Sympathizer, and NVA agent, or BC agent, who was infiltrated South Vietnamese army, and when the Saigon falls, goes with them into exile to continue spying on the South Vietnamese in exile. Was that entirely fictional, or do you know of any cases that like that?
Well, I mean, Pham Xuan An, the Vietnamese spy who came here in the 50s, that was a loose inspiration for this novel. But he went back to Vietnam and he never left Vietnam. Now whether or not there were Vietnamese spies who actually came in 1975 and spied here. Now, if you ask the Vietnamese refugee community, they're like, yeah, and they're still here. And they believe that it happens. It may very well be true. That's actually probably a very plausible scenario. It's never been proven as far as I know, but that's enough for a writer to go from.
And, the other one was, I'm just wondering how believable it is that somebody who's a Eurasian, half European and half Asian, would ever become, or be accepted, for that matter, by the NVA or the VC, when they automatically toss him out as a traitor, because he's a half-blood or whatever you want to call him. I mean, a mixed blood.
No, I mean, Vietnamese people are racist, but they're also pragmatic. Okay, so I mean, I think there are many Eurasians in Vietnamese history because of the French and whatever, and they were incorporated into Vietnamese society and were part of the Vietnamese military and things like that. Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. Yes.
How has your writing been accepted received in the Vietnamese community in this country? Question one. Question two, are there plans to translate any of your work into Vietnamese?
How has my writing been accepted by the Vietnamese community in the U.S., and are there plans to translate it into Vietnamese? And, I think when the novel came out, and Vietnamese Americans who read it in English and Vietnamese people in Vietnam who read it in English, the reception was uniformly positive, at least what was said to me. If you know anything about Vietnamese people, what is said to you, to your face, is different than what is said elsewhere. Okay.
Okay. Well,
She says it's been good. Okay.
when he answers, he repeats it.
I mean, partially because a lot of Vietnamese, so people who lived through the time period who've read the book said, I really captured the flavor of the time and the historical thing and everything. And younger people who did not live through it, some of them have told me it's either very moving for them or it's very difficult for them because it reawakens all these traumatic feelings that they've had and they didn't want to confront. And then Vietnamese people who haven't read the book because they only read Vietnamese, I think there's more trepidation. Because they hear that the novel is about a communist spy, and they're like, what? We can't have a novel about a communist spy. All commies are bad, Then the novel wins the Pulitzer Prize. And apparently all is forgiven, Because now I'm pretty sure most Vietnamese people have not read my book, but they all want to take a selfie with me, My dad, when the novel was published, he was like, okay, yeah, you published a novel, whatever. I win the Pulitzer Prize, and I did not call home, because I think when I was growing up, you did not go home and say, hey, I got an A. You only went home if you got a B+ or an A-, and you had to say that. So I won the Pulitzer Prize, and literally it did not occur to me to call my parents. I was like, whatever, of course, whatever. So then my dad calls me like 2 days later. I'm on the road. He says, the relatives in Vietnam called, you won the Pulitzer Prize. And he was so happy. His voice was giddy with happiness. And you have to understand my dad, he does not get giddy with happiness. So that was like the Vietnamese reaction, you know. So then we sold the translation rights to all three of my books that I published in the last 3 years, all about Vietnam. And apparently these two publishers think we can get this done. You know, they're like, hey, come back for a book tour. I'm like, let me wait first until you publish it before I decide to go back for a book tour. Let's see what the government thinks. Let me see if the government's going to censor this. Let me see if the government's going to put me in prison or not. I have no idea. You know, I have no idea what the reaction will be. But anyway, The Sympathizer is close to being done in translation. There's many complications because the language is a very complicated issue. There's dialect differences. The language changed in 1975. And so I'm going to have this manuscript vetted by my own translator to make sure we get these nuances right, and they didn't cut out the squid episode, for example, stuff like that. and then we have to submit it for censorship in Vietnam. Like, you know, the government censorship office is a different thing than the publishers, so it's going to be very complicated.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to take one more question from the folks out in the lobby. So, you keep mentioning the love story in The Sympathizer. What is the love story?
Did I mention the love story?
Whoa, who did? You did. Yes. The love between the protagonist's mother or between the protagonist and Lana. How do you define love?
Oh my God. I remember the first time a girlfriend said, I love you to me when I was like 17. And my reaction was exactly what just happened right now. You know, it's like, I don't know. It's like, I did not grow up in an environment where my parents said stuff like, I love you. And it's like Vietnamese people don't say this kind of stuff. As a matter of fact, Lac Su, another Vietnamese American author, wrote a book called I Love Yous Are for White People. Okay? So love is a very different thing. And so for me, when I was growing up, love was not about romance. It was about sacrifice and devotion and taking care of the family and all that kind of stuff. And so then learning how to say I love you in a romantic sense was a very difficult thing for me. And a lot of it was just wrapped up in lust. I was like, oh, I lust you. Okay, that's good. So that's a part of it. But I think that the Sympathizer maybe reveals that because romantic love in this novel is not an important issue.
Right.
He's not really in romantic love with anybody. As he says, it's like, a month has passed, it's about time for me to fall in love again. At some point he says that in the novel, right? And so for him, love and lust are the same thing. Mm-hmm. And this is actually very central to the novel. Because as I discovered, as I wrote the novel, my protagonist doesn't know how to love people. Love women. He doesn't know how to love women. He knows how to love his mother. He doesn't know how to love women. And that is actually fundamental to his character. He doesn't know it. He thinks what he's about is revolution, politics, ideology. But what he's also about is love, unacknowledged incapacity for love, and the objectification of women. Mm-hmm. And I discovered that about him as I wrote about him. That wasn't really intentional. And that is, all those two things are related because he's so obsessed with revolution and ideology that he doesn't understand that revolution is this kind of revolution and most revolutions are completely masculinist, heteronormative, to use an academic term, discourses. You know, like revolutions are driven by men, right? And the objectification of women and the exploitation of love is just a part of that. Mm-hmm. And that's why the climax of the novel in the interrogation is about the complete unraveling and revelation of how the revolution is built on the exploitation of women and the use of heterosexual ideology. And he's completely blind to that. And so that's something that needs to be worked out in the sequel to this novel, The Committed, where he does have to try to figure out what does love mean? And how do I relate to women outside of objectifying them? He doesn't know how to do that in this novel. And I, for a long time, didn't know how to do that either. I I went to an all-boys high school, okay? So that I blame everything on that. But I think also for me personally, it's like I also learned a lot more about love after I became a father. Just to say that, like I had a son and I was like, oh my God, I love this person. And that has been enormously emotionally meaningful for me as a revelation about who I am and what this emotion is.
That's great.
Let's end on that note, because usually I always end on like, oh my God, war is hell. So let's end on love. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that.
That was wonderful. Yeah, that was a lot of fun.
Awesome. That was really great.
The audience was great, and you asked some really wonderful questions.
Well,
too.
thank you. It was a privilege. So, yeah, let's stand up. Let's stand up. That was great. Yeah.